In the aftermath of the tragic Usindiso building fire in Johannesburg's CBD, where 77 lives were lost, the quest for justice has been painstakingly intense. Led by Justice Sisi Khampepe, the Commission has diligently gathered evidence, with part 1 of the report now in the hands of Gauteng Premier Panyaza Lesufi. It is set to be released tomorrow. Today, we're joined by human rights activist Andy Chinnah, who has been closely involved in the inquiry from its inception. Andy, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. Really do appreciate it. Look, the terms of reference of this inquiry had been very specific and also very limited to that. But the inner city crisis is beyond the Usindiso building. What does justice look like after this report is being released?
Well, firstly, we've got to focus on the actual fire. It was one of the biggest fires in in Africa. We lost 76 lives, not 77. But, you know, for the victims, the commission was very important because they got to tell their stories about exactly what the conditions were before and what the conditions were during the fire and what caused the fire, which the terms of reference are what about, you know, it's about what happened before the fire, what happened during the fire, and who caused it, and what actions will be taken after that.
Yeah, the remedial actions will have to be as restorative as they possibly can, but they also have to be to some extent compensatory. To what extent do you think that fulfills the ambits of justice? Well,
I followed the commission and sat through the commission every single day. One of the things was in the closing arguments, Advocate Semenya, who's been brilliant as a lead evidence person, said, is it the commission's duty to find what reparation needs to come to the victims? So that's going to be a big question coming out of this document.
If not, whose duty would it then be? A court of law?
Yes, correct. So the commission by nature, is an inquiry. It's not a judicial decision. It would make a recommendation, and part of those recommendations would say who's responsible for this and what action should take place.
Yeah. Do you foresee any sort of prosecution being recommended coming out of this?
As an activist, that's the second part of the fight. You know, it's one thing to start saying what happened, who's responsible for it, but then we need to push the person that's responsible or the entity that's responsible to the justice system and say, justice, can we see some justice here? I mean, there's been a big emphasis throughout the hearings that the city of Joburg has been responsible for this building. It was their building. You know, this term of hijacked it was not a hijacked building.
It was an abandoned building, and the classification between the hijacked and abandoned buildings are quite clear.
Correct.
So and you're invoking here the city of Johannesburg, and perhaps this is an important point to then ask. What recommendations around governance and policy-related matters would you like to see come out? Part of the work of the commission is not just to collect evidence, but to also speak to activists and experts about what corrective behaviors, corrective interventions should be like, especially around governance and policy.
Oliver, you know, it's been our fight from the beginning to say from this disaster we must learn something. We must have blueprints in place to make sure that this does not happen again. You know, also we need to look at the governance models within the city in terms of what buildings are in the city in this state and what are they going to do in terms of preventing a loss of life like this.
Yeah, the city of Johannesburg has at some point been ordered by the courts to do a full audit of its rental stock, or at least its property stock, and that's to say which buildings do you own and which are occupied, and by who are these buildings occupied. That's a first step to knowing who's there and what we have. The city of Johannesburg hasn't yet released any sort of conclusive report on any such audit. To what extent are you then worried that very little progress will be made after the fact?
We can achieve anything in South Africa if there's a will. There has been absolutely no will till today. You know, it's been more than 6 months. In the first interviews that were given on TV by government officials, they said they would have 3 buildings ready. We are now hearing that from the mayor the other day in his speech, saying that, you know, he will renovate some buildings. So if you're asking about stock, we've waited how many years for this report to come out? It shows that there's no will to actually have an action plan.
Yeah, social housing, and by and large, housing is largely the responsibility of provincial governments, but here we're talking about city-owned buildings. It's a very clear distinction between the city of Johannesburg and the government of the Gauteng province. Where do you think the social housing conversation is being bottlenecked?
We the people don't really care whether it's local or national or provincial. What we need to look at is the constitution, which says that there should be adequate housing. There are three spheres of government. We must never, as we the people, make it our problem to say it's provincial or it's national. We live in a city. The city is supposed to provide that. Human settlements is part of the city. It's a department within the city, and they need to provide that.
Those who were inhabitants of the building had been relocated to a temporary accommodation site. They are lamenting the state of that temporary accommodation site, saying that there's not adequate sanitation and services, basic services aren't provided. Many of them, for instance, don't have access to an ID still yet, that they lost in the fire, and essential documents. Right. Many of their children have not been able to go back to school as a result of that. They protested recently to the mayor, to the office of the mayor in the city of Johannesburg, handing over a memorandum of demands around what is to be done at this temporary accommodation facility. Talk to us about what their conditionalities have been over the last couple of months.
Horrific, to be quite frank with you. They've been moved from Hofland Park, which was a recreation hall down in Bez Valley, into Denver. And Denver is an industrial area. If you look at the quality of those little tinfoil shacks, it's I don't know. I don't understand who has actually come up with an idea to say this is adequate housing. People, as you point out, people don't have access to the economic hub of Joburg. You got to pay 32 Rand for a return trip from Denver just to come and sell some of your merchandise in the city of in the central city. Those individuals, we must realize, were informal traders, many of them. This is where their heart is. Their heart is.
Have none of them received social assistance through the form of social welfare grants?
How much? You lose everything in the fire. You don't expect to be dumped somewhere like in Denver and then saying, here's a handout to you. I mean, one of the international organizations offered people 4,000 Rand to leave the shelter, last year in November. That is a smack in the face of a victim who has lost everything. They've lost everything, and people don't understand what that means. To start to say you have a social grant, get back on your feet, I see it every single day. I see the victims. I see their pain. I see the fact that they cannot survive. One of the victims has a child who's a special needs child. The transport alone from where she's been placed cost 1,200 Rand. She gets a grant of 1,500 Rand. She's got another child. How does she survive on 300 Rand?
Yeah, just a last question. Psychosocial support is important in the aftermath of such a devastating traumatic event. Has that been provided by the state or any other NGO out there specifically for the victims currently staying in the Denver temporary accommodation site?
It's been also shocking, the amount of support that we've received. Even at the Commission of Inquiry, you could see people breaking down on stage, and the psychologists never responded as they should respond. It's a major concern. We have private psychologists who have given up their times. So we have initiatives where we are actually doing trauma counseling with a group of ladies from Denver, for example. So, social society has stepped up, but the government hasn't. The government hasn't.
Yeah. Andy, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Really do appreciate it. Andy Chinnah, who's an activist. That report's coming out tomorrow afternoon. The Premier of Gauteng Province will be publicizing that report. We'll study it and bring you the details of it and speak to the relevant stakeholders in it.